The bell over the diner door jingled, breaking the lazy hum of lunchtime chatter. Every head turned for just a second, long enough to notice the man who had stepped inside. His clothes were worn, a faded army jacket zipped halfway, shoes scuffed almost to the sole. His hair was messy, but clean enough to show he'd tried. The air shifted, not with noise, but with judgment. He walked slowly to the counter, shoulders straight, eyes calm, as if he didn't see the curious glances tracking him. A few customers whispered, trying not to be obvious. One woman pulled her purse closer. Behind the counter, the waitress, a young blonde named Tracy, caught sight of him and sighed loudly, exaggerating it for the room to hear. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone already sharp, her eyes rolling slightly. "Yes," the man said softly. His voice was low but steady, carrying the kind of dignity that didn't need to be loud. "I'd like a cup of coffee, please." Tracy looked him up and down, her lips curving into a half smirk. "You sure you can afford it?" she asked, tapping her nails on the counter. A couple of customers chuckled under their breath. He didn't react. "I can pay," he said, pulling a few crumpled bills from his pocket. They were worn but real, the kind of money that came from small jobs and long days. Tracy scoffed. "Right. One black coffee, huh? Let me guess. No cream or sugar. Trying to keep it simple." Her sarcasm cut through the air like glass. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he gave a small, polite nod. "Black is fine. Thank you." She grabbed a cup, slamming it down a little too hard on the counter, before pouring the coffee. "Here," she said, pushing it toward him, without looking up. He reached for it, but she pulled it back slightly. "Hold on. You're not going to sit in here, are you? We have paying customers." He looked down at the money still in his hand. "I am a paying customer," he said quietly. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Even the radio seemed to turn itself down. Tracy let out a cold laugh. "Look, this place has a certain standard, okay? Maybe try the diner down the street. They don't mind your kind." He stared at her for a moment. Not angry, not pleading, just disappointed. Then, without another word, he set his money gently on the counter and turned to leave. As he pushed open the door, the little bell jingled again, but this time the sound didn't feel welcoming. It sounded like judgment closing behind him. No one in the room spoke. Tracy shrugged and went back to wiping the counter, muttering, "People need to learn where they belong." What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that the man who had just walked out would be back, and when he returned, she would realize exactly who belonged. The lunch rush grew busier as the clock ticked toward noon, but the air in the diner still carried the awkward tension left behind by the man who had just walked out. Tracy was back to her routine, pretending nothing had happened. She poured coffee for the regulars, laughed too loudly at bad jokes, and kept glancing at the door as if proud of having protected the place from someone who didn't fit her idea of a customer. At a corner booth, two businessmen whispered to each other, smirking. "Did you see that guy? Looked like he walked out of a shelter," one said. The other chuckled. "I can't believe he actually thought he could eat here." Their laughter spread like cheap perfume, loud, artificial, impossible to ignore. Tracy overheard them and smiled in quiet agreement. "Yeah, he comes in here sometimes," she lied. "Always asking for free stuff. Thinks being polite makes him special or something." Her voice carried across the room, making sure everyone heard. She wanted to be the funny one, the one who wasn't afraid to say what everyone was thinking but didn't have the nerve to say aloud. An older waitress named Maggie, polishing silverware nearby, gave Tracy a look of quiet disappointment. "That wasn't nice," she said. "He didn't bother anybody." Tracy shrugged, unfazed. "Maggie, please. If we let everyone like him in here, this place would smell like a bus stop." Maggie sighed, shaking her head. "Maybe he just wanted a cup of coffee. You don't know what that man's been through." Tracy rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on. You think he's some kind of saint? He's just another guy who made bad choices." The bell over the door jingled again, and for a moment Tracy froze, expecting him to return. But it was only a delivery man dropping off supplies. She exhaled dramatically, laughing at herself. "See? Guess he finally figured out where he belongs." The businessman snickered again, nodding approvingly. Tracy soaked in their attention like sunlight. She wasn't cruel for the sake of being cruel. Not in her mind. She thought she was being clever, in control, a protector of class. Outside, though, just down the street, the man she mocked sat quietly on a park bench. He wasn't broken, just thoughtful. He sipped a small cup of coffee he'd bought from a street cart with his remaining change. His hands were steady, his posture straight, his expression calm. He wasn't angry. He'd seen worse things than a rude waitress. But the moment she laughed at him, that was something he wouldn't forget. Not because it hurt his pride, but because he recognized the familiar arrogance of someone who judged without understanding. He'd once employed people like her. He'd once given second chances to those who thought they were above kindness. The world had turned on him since then, but not in the way she thought. Life had changed, but his values hadn't. He finished his coffee, stood up, and glanced back at the diner across the street. The place that thought it was better than him. Then he smiled. Not out of revenge, but patience. He wasn't done there, not yet. He had a reason to come back. And next time, the laughter would stop the moment he walked through that door. The next morning, sunlight spilled over the city like a quiet promise. A new day. But the diner was the same. The same clinking of cups, the same smell of coffee and frying bacon, the same laughter echoing from the same customers who thought they had life figured out. Tracy stood behind the counter again, her hair perfectly curled, phone propped up nearby, scrolling through her social feed between orders. She had already forgotten the man from yesterday, or at least she thought she had. Maggie hadn't. She moved slower today, quieter, like something about yesterday didn't sit right. As she poured coffee for a regular, she glanced at Tracy. "You ever think maybe we judge people too quick?" she asked softly. Tracy frowned. "You're not still thinking about that guy, are you?" "Maybe I am," Maggie said, setting the pot down. "Didn't like the way it felt, the way we laughed." Tracy waved her off. "You're too sentimental, Maggie. If you worked front counter as long as I have, you'd know who's worth serving and who's not." The bell over the door jingled, that familiar little chime that seemed to mark the start of every story in that place. Tracy looked up, expecting a delivery or a regular customer, but her words caught in her throat. It was him. The same man from yesterday. Only this time, he wasn't wearing the faded army jacket or scuffed shoes. His hair was neatly cut, his beard trimmed, his posture commanding. He wore clean, pressed clothes, not flashy, just sharp, the kind of look that quietly demanded respect. The small diner suddenly felt too small for the weight he carried just by standing there. Conversation stuttered to a halt. The two businessmen from yesterday blinked in disbelief. One of them muttered, "Is that the same guy?" Tracy froze, coffee pot halfway in the air. She recognized his face instantly, but her brain couldn't process the rest. He didn't look poor. He didn't look broken. He didn't even look mad. He just looked in control. He walked calmly to the counter, same steady pace as before. Same calm eyes. But this time, the silence followed him like respect. "Good morning," he said, voice smooth but firm. "I'd like a table for two, please." Tracy blinked. A table?" She stammered for the first time in her shift. Sure, right away." She scrambled to grab menus, her face flushing red. He followed her to a booth near the window, sitting down with quiet confidence. He didn't need to make a scene. His presence did all the talking. Tracy stood awkwardly by the table, pen trembling in her hand. "Can I, get you something to drink?" she asked, trying to sound casual. He smiled politely. "Coffee, please. Black." The words hit her like a memory she wanted to erase. She nodded quickly and hurried back to the counter, avoiding Maggie's knowing look. Maggie didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't need to. Tracy poured the coffee carefully this time, using a clean cup, placing it on a fresh saucer. Her hands were shaking slightly. As she brought it to his table, she couldn't help but notice how differently the other customers looked at him now. The same people who had laughed yesterday were sitting up straighter, speaking quieter. Respect was contagious. He took the cup with a nod. "Thank you." "You're welcome," she whispered. Then he added, just loud enough for her to hear, "I appreciate you serving me today." Her heart sank. The words weren't angry, but they carried a weight heavier than any insult. She opened her mouth to respond, to apologize maybe. But before she could speak, the bell above the door rang again. A tall man in a dark suit stepped in, scanning the diner until his face broke into a wide grin. "There you are," the man said loudly, crossing the room with excitement. "I was wondering where you disappeared to, sir." Every head turned. "Sir." The man stood up, shaking the newcomer's hand warmly. The energy in the room shifted again, this time to pure confusion. Tracy's eyes widened as the man in the suit smiled and said clearly enough for everyone to hear, "Welcome back, Mr. Hayes. The owner's been asking for you all morning." The diner went silent. The air in the diner went still, like the entire room had stopped breathing. Every fork froze halfway to every mouth. Tracy stood rooted beside the counter, the coffee pot trembling slightly in her hand. Mr. Hayes, the man she'd mocked, humiliated, dismissed, now stood tall, shaking hands with a man whose watch alone probably cost more than the entire diner. The suited man, cheerful and professional, spoke with unshaken respect. "The owner's been waiting for you, sir. He's been telling everyone about you coming back into town. I didn't realize you were already here." Mr. Hayes smiled warmly. "I got in early. Thought I'd stop by for a cup of coffee." There was a quiet edge in that last word, a gentle reminder wrapped in perfect politeness. Tracy's heart dropped into her stomach. She could feel every customer's eyes on her now, burning holes of judgment into the back of her head. Maggie watched silently from the corner, her lips pressed into a thin, knowing line. The suited man turned toward the stunned waitress. "Could you please bring a menu for Mr. Hayes? The owner will be joining him in a few minutes." Tracy nodded quickly, voice small. Yes, of course. Right away." Her hands fumbled with the menu as she placed it gently in front of him, unable to meet his gaze. Her throat felt dry, her stomach twisted into knots. Every ounce of confidence she had yesterday was gone, replaced by a cold, sinking awareness of just how wrong she had been. Hayes gave her a polite smile, not cruel, not mocking, just calm. "Thank you," he said softly. "I appreciate the service." The kindness stung more than anger ever could. A few minutes later, the bell jingled again. This time, an older man with silver hair and a warm smile walked in. He was the restaurant owner, Mr. Cooper. Everyone in the diner knew his face. He glanced around until his eyes landed on Mr. Hayes, and then his entire expression lit up. "Daniel Hayes!" he exclaimed, crossing the room quickly. "Hey, you old son of a gun." The two men shook hands firmly, then hugged like family. The entire diner watched in stunned silence. "You all remember Daniel Hayes, right?" Mr. Cooper said, turning toward the room with a proud smile. "He used to own this building before I bought it from him years ago. Without him, this place wouldn't even exist." Murmurs spread instantly. Heads turned, eyes widened. A few of the customers who had laughed yesterday now sank deeper into their booths, wishing they could disappear. Tracy stood motionless, her face pale. Her mind replayed every cruel word she had thrown at him, every smirk, every snide comment, every laugh. He wasn't a nobody. He never had been. He was the reason this diner existed. Mr. Cooper pulled out a chair. "Sit, Daniel. You're family here. Lunch is on the house." Hayes gave a small smile. "Thank you, but I'll pay for my coffee. Always do." That one sentence landed like thunder. It wasn't about money. It was about principle, about dignity. Tracy finally whispered, barely audible, "I'm sorry." He turned to her, meeting her eyes for the first time since yesterday. His look wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. It was human. The kind of look that makes you see yourself clearly, whether you want to or not. "Don't be sorry," he said quietly. "Just remember, everyone you serve has a story. You never know who's sitting at your counter." Tracy nodded, tears threatening to spill, her voice trembling. "I'll remember." Mr. Cooper frowned slightly, glancing at her. "Everything all right here?" Mr. Hayes smiled faintly. "Better than it was yesterday." And then he turned back to his coffee, calm, steady, dignified, as the entire diner finally understood the lesson that had just walked in and sat down among them. The diner felt different now. The same walls, same lights, same smell of coffee and frying bacon, but everything had shifted. The laughter that had once filled the room had been replaced by quiet murmurs and uneasy glances. Every person who had snickered yesterday now sat still, stirring their cups without drinking. Tracy moved slower, each step weighed down by the memory of her own words. She wasn't just embarrassed. She was ashamed. Every time she passed Mr. Hayes's table, her chest tightened. She wanted to say something, anything, but guilt held her tongue. Maggie, wiping down the counter, watched her carefully. "You can't change yesterday," she said softly, "but you can change what you do next." Tracy nodded faintly. "I don't even know what to say to him." "Start with the truth," Maggie said. It usually works. At the booth, Mr. Cooper and Mr. Hayes talked like old friends. Laughter between men who had built something together, men who understood work, failure, and dignity. Every time Cooper spoke, his tone carried warmth and respect. Daniel, you always did have that heart for people, he said. Still do, from what I see. Mr. Hayes smiled faintly. Trying my best. The world's different now, but kindness still works the same way. That line lingered in the air, reaching every corner of the diner. It wasn't said loud, but everyone heard it. It found Tracy, too, cutting deeper than any reprimand could. A few customers stood up quietly and walked over to him. One of the businessmen from yesterday, the same man who had mocked him, cleared his throat. Sir, he said awkwardly, I owe you an apology. I laughed when I shouldn't have. You didn't deserve that. Mr. Hayes looked up, eyes kind but steady. Thank you, he said. I appreciate that. The man nodded, relief washing over his face, and returned to his seat. Tracy finally gathered enough courage to approach. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped closer, her voice trembling. Mr. Hayes, she began, eyes down. I wanted to say I'm sorry for how I treated you yesterday. It was wrong. I was rude, and I let other people's opinions guide me instead of my own heart. He looked at her, calm and quiet. There was no anger in his expression, only a tired understanding. Do you know what I saw in your eyes yesterday? He asked gently. She swallowed hard. Disgust, I guess. He shook his head. No. Fear. You were afraid that someone like me would remind you how easy it is for the world to flip. How one bad day can turn anyone into a person they once looked down on. Tracy's eyes filled with tears. You're right, she whispered. I've been so scared of being poor that I forgot what being kind looks like. He nodded once, accepting her words like a teacher accepts the right answer. Without pride, just quiet acknowledgement. Then you've already learned something valuable. She exhaled shakily. Can I get you anything else? On the house this time, he smiled. No, thank you. I think I've had all I need. The simple reply carried more weight than a sermon. As Tracy turned to walk back, Maggie placed a gentle hand on her arm. See? Not so hard, was it? Tracy managed a small, tearful smile, hard enough to remember. At the booth, Mr. Cooper laughed heartily at something Mr. Hayes said, and for the first time all day, the diner began to breathe again. The mood lightened, not with noise, but with understanding. Kindness had returned to the room. The kind that doesn't cost a dime, yet changes everything it touches. When the plates were cleared and the laughter had faded to soft conversation, the diner returned to its usual rhythm. But something about it was cleaner now. Lighter, like the whole place had exhaled. Mr. Hayes sat quietly by the window, finishing his coffee. The sunlight touched his face, revealing years of experience, loss, and peace, all woven into one expression. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to say much. The world spoke for him now, Mr. Cooper leaned back in the booth. You know, he said, when I first bought this place from you, I didn't think I could fill your shoes. It took me years to realize what made this diner special wasn't the building. It was how you treated people. Hayes smiled, eyes drifting toward the counter, where Tracy was wiping down tables, quieter than usual. Looks like it still has that potential, he said softly. Cooper chuckled. It does now. Hayes stood, slipping a few bills beneath his coffee cup, more than enough to cover the drink. He shook Cooper's hand one last time. Keep it running, Tom. The world needs more places like this. You've got my word, Cooper said, gripping his hand firmly. As Hayes turned to leave, the bell over the door chimed, the same sound that once carried laughter at his expense. This time, it carried silence and respect. Tracy looked up just as he passed. Their eyes met. For a moment, she expected him to say something, maybe another gentle lesson, maybe nothing at all. But instead, he just nodded once. A small gesture, simple but full of meaning. Forgiveness didn't need to be spoken. It had already happened. Maggie walked up beside Tracy, watching him go. You see that? She said quietly. Tracy nodded, her voice small. Yeah. He didn't even need to say goodbye. That's how decent people do it, Maggie replied. They don't rub it in. They just leave you better than they found you. Tracy looked down at the counter where he'd sat, the untouched sugar packet, the faint ring of his coffee cup, and the bills tucked neatly under the saucer. She pulled them out and froze. There was more than money. Beneath the bills lay a folded napkin. On it, in small, careful handwriting, were just 4 words. Be kind. Always. Tracy stared at the message, her chest tightening. The tears came quietly this time, not from guilt, but gratitude. She placed the napkin inside her apron pocket, like something sacred. When she turned around, Maggie smiled softly. Guess that's your tip for the day. Tracy nodded. Best one I've ever gotten. The door shut behind Mr. Hayes, the bell ringing one last time. Outside, he walked down the sunny street, not as a man looking for acceptance, but as someone who had already found peace. Inside the diner, the energy was new. Customers smiled at one another. Maggie hummed an old tune, and Tracy, for the first time in her life, understood what service really meant. It wasn't just about food. It was about heart. The afternoon sun hung low now, spilling soft gold through the diner windows. The quiet hum of conversation had returned, but something about it was different. Lighter, more human. What had started as an ordinary workday had become something the entire town would remember. Tracy stood by the counter, lost in thought as she refilled the sugar jars. Every few minutes, she caught herself glancing toward the door, half expecting the man to walk in again. He didn't. But in a way, he didn't have to. The napkin in her apron pocket was proof he'd left something behind that no one could take away. Maggie walked up beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. She slid one toward Tracy. You did good, kid. Tracy looked at her, frowning softly. I was awful to him. Yesterday, yeah, Maggie said. But today you learned something most people never do. Humility. That's the beginning of decency. Tracy took a slow sip, eyes on the street outside. She saw a man in a worn jacket walking by, not Hayes, just another stranger. Still, she smiled at him and waved. The man hesitated, surprised, then smiled back. Feels different, doesn't it? Maggie said. Tracy nodded. Yeah, like I finally see people again. At one of the booths, Mr. Cooper counted the cash Mr. Hayes had left behind. When he saw the amount, he chuckled quietly. The man paid for everyone's coffee, he said to himself, shaking his head, still as generous as ever. He looked toward Tracy. He asked me to remind you all something, Cooper said gently. That the way we treat others, that's the real price of what we serve. The words settled like sunlight after rain. Tracy smiled faintly. Guess I needed that. Later that evening, as the last customers trickled out, she cleaned the same counter where she'd once humiliated a man for being less than she thought he was. This time, she polished it until it shone. When she was done, she pulled out the napkin from her pocket. Be kind, always. She unfolded it again, running her thumb over the handwriting as though it carried warmth. Then, she taped it to the inside of the counter, a quiet reminder only she could see, every shift, every day. Outside, the sky had turned orange and pink, fading into twilight. Tracy locked the door, turned off the lights, and looked once more at the booth by the window. The empty seat somehow didn't feel empty at all, because he had left behind something no one else ever could, a piece of grace. As she stepped out and closed the door behind her, she whispered softly to herself, I'll do better. And for the first time in a long time, she meant it. The bell above the door gave one last gentle ring in the quiet air. Not judgment this time, not mockery. Just forgiveness.